Last week, the finance minister gave his annual fiscal update, and most of the attention was given to the deficit and the projected surplus. But there was another line in that speech that is crucial to everything, and it will be the question for the bottom line. Patty Croft is an economist and former senior bank executive. Jim Stanford is an economist with Unifor. Preet Banerjee is a freelance writer and broadcast journalist. And Amanda Lang is our senior business correspondent. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, the context. No one has ever accused Joe Oliver of being dynamic, and last week his fiscal update was another example of why. Dry, plodding, bureaucratic. But he asked one key question near the end of his remarks, one all Canadians have a huge stake in answering.
So where does the path to prosperity lie?
Implicit in the asking is that Oliver thinks the country is on the right path to that goal. And there are some good signs. The deficit is under $3 billion this year, and it's forecast to be in surplus next year and for years to come. But that is just a forecast, and Oliver knows there are variables at play that may chip away at his path to prosperity. Look at oil. A few months ago, it was at $100 a barrel and the centerpiece of Canada's national economic strategy. It's now in the mid-70s and costing Ottawa billions every year in lost tax revenue. Look at Europe and its pathetic growth rate barely dodging recession territory. This while Canada needs a strong Europe for trade. And what's up with our two biggest trading partners, the U.S. and China, suddenly cutting a deal on emissions that Ottawa has always said, if implemented here, would impact our economy? And President Obama signaling that Canada's plan to ship oil through a Keystone pipeline across his country wouldn't make it across his desk.
It is providing the ability of Canada to pump their oil, send it through our land down to the Gulf, where it will be sold everywhere else.
So, is Canada's road to prosperity in trouble? And is it time to consider a different route? Good questions. Time for some answers. Okay, let's start with the big one. Is Canada on the right road to prosperity? Patty.
I think we are, Peter, and I think in terms of where we go from here, to me, the key is budgetary surpluses, particularly at the federal level. Because if you think about it, that gives you options. If you're running budgetary surpluses, we can have the conversation about how do we increase prosperity? Is it through world-class education? Is it through a national policy on climate change or better infrastructure? But I think the key is those budgetary surpluses.
All right, so a yes there. Jim.
Peter, I think budgetary surpluses have almost nothing to do with our prosperity. I actually think there's a much deeper ingredient in any path to prosperity, and it's a four-letter word, work, W-O-R-K. And on Monday mornings, it seems like a four-letter word. We have to put more Canadians in work, and we have to get them working more productively, more efficiently to generate the wealth that we need for prosperity. And budget surpluses have almost nothing to do with that. In terms of the quantity of Canadians in work, we've been ho-hum. We've created some jobs, but not enough to keep up with our rapidly growing population. The quality or efficiency of work, we've been miserable. We rank 27th out of 34 OECD countries in productivity growth, in R&D and innovation spending. So that's where the key to prosperity will lie, work.
So I take it from your answer. Your answer is no, we are not on the road to prosperity. Preet, yes or no?
Sounded very ominous, but I think we're doing relatively well. I mean, if you take a look at what happened in the U.S. over the last 7 years and compare how Canada's done, you can't say things are all bad. There are certainly areas of weakness. The labor market, I don't think is properly reflected by the headline unemployment numbers, but TD came out with a new labor index, which takes a look at things like people who are working part-time on an involuntary basis, or people who are unemployed and have run out of employment insurance benefits. And so when you take all those together, there's certainly some weakness in jobs.
So a maybe?
A maybe, but I'm optimistic.
All right. Amanda.
I'm closer to Jim than anywhere else. What I would say is at the moment, Canada's in a tough place because we're just fine. You know, we're in a very Canadian place. You know that old expression that as Canadian as possible under the circumstances, or as necessary under the circumstances. We're doing okay, but prosperity is not okay. Prosperity is actually big, bold, visionary stuff, and we're not seeing that happening. And I do think we're at a place in our country's history where we're going to have a big think about what are the jobs of the future? What will our grandchildren be doing? Because the chances are they're not going to be digging oil out of the ground.
Well, let's look at this from the sense, no matter whether yes, no, or maybe, whether there are areas within our economy that perhaps we should be moving away from to really achieve that prosperity.
Well, of course, Peter, we talked a lot about oil in the setup, and we've been kind of focused on oil. I don't think we're ever going to move away from oil or resources in a general sense, but I do think we have to get a lot better at how we manage our resource wealth. Resources are always going to be a big part of our economy, but we have to get more proactive at maximizing the spin-off benefits to Canada and limiting the costs, including the environmental costs. I'm very interested in trying to maximize Canadian value added in our resource industries, use more Canadian machinery and equipment and services in resource extraction, and then refine and manufacture the products here once we extract it. That's one way to get more bang for the buck from our resources.
Patty.
I think a sector that's actually moving away from us is manufacturing. And I think that has everything to do with globalization. Globalization often gets a bad rap. It's blamed for job losses and income inequality. But I think it's inevitable, and it's actually a good thing, creating growth and opportunities. So I think the decline in manufacturing in Canada, unfortunately, has further to go, particularly at the lower end. We are going to see things produced elsewhere in the world at cheaper rates. So I think manufacturing, unfortunately, is going to continue to erode.
Amanda.
Well, I would actually say our resource industries is something to move away from, in the sense that...
That's twice you've agreed with me. The show just started, by the way.
I'm agreeing, but I'm disagreeing.
Okay,
in the sense that I disagree that it'll be around forever. To me, we need to actually have a scenario planning that says it's not actually around, that there's a situation in which the world does not rely on fossil fuels. It could happen in our lifetime. And it may not happen, and we certainly have great, vast wealth because people need fossil fuels, and we should manage it accordingly. It's a great gift that Canadians have. But let's, I think, have a government that at least considers a scenario where we have an economy that is not entirely based on resources, natural resources, because there are some scenarios where that could happen.
All right, let's flip the question around then as to where we should be moving towards something, a new area. Preet?
Well, demography would suggest that we need to increase our focus on healthcare. So obviously, everyone knows that the population on average is aging. There's a lot of ideas out there, but there's a lot of frustration as well. So this, over the long term, is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. And so we need to focus more attention on actually figuring out what is it exactly, what is our 50-year plan when it comes to healthcare.
And what are you thinking when you say that? In what ways would we focus our attention on that?
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, there's positives and negatives to it. I mean, one positive is that as people retire, as they get older, then people who are entering the workforce, they're going to have more jobs, and hopefully that'll translate into more earnings. But at the same time, you've got more and more people who might be seen as, taking away from the revenues and spending and whatnot. So we have to figure out how do we do that? How do we managing the health care as people are living longer? What health concerns do they have? So there's so many different aspects of healthcare and aging that we need to consider.
Jim, new areas.
Well, I'm not sure about what specific sectors to focus on, but I know about the kinds of sectors that we need. We need sectors that are innovation intensive, a lot of technology, that are tradable, that sell their output to world markets, that have strong linkages to other sectors of the economy, supply chain effects, so you get spin-off benefits, and that pay higher than average incomes. Those are the criteria that show you've got a sector that's strategically important. And it's not going to be retail, and it's not going to be fast food. Those are sectors that come automatically when an economy has income. So it will include, I think, manufacturing. I actually think manufacturing has a more positive future here than Patty indicated, although it will be higher value, technology-intensive manufacturing. But it will also include other service sectors where we can add value, add knowledge, use our expertise to make it very valuable. In the old days, we used to try and nurture those sectors through what we used to call industrial policy. I think we're going to need more of those types of measures to focus on those strategic sectors.
Right. He's talking about innovation. He must have just read your book.
This is kind of a setup, I have to say, because I agree 100%. I mean, to me, when I interviewed the finance minister last week, my question to him was, you've got a majority government with a majority government mandate. That's when you can do big visionary things. What's the big vision?
In the last year of a mandate, though?
You know what? Well, they've maybe squandered their mandate, but what I would say is, if you think of a country that needs a plan, and you realize that in no time in history has a major industry grown up without real government thought and support, whether it's Silicon Valley or Israel's great tech boom.
Or even the oil sands.
Or the oil sands. We don't need to shrink from it. We could say, let's be world-class in renewables. Let's export our healthcare expertise all over the world. We're already strong in biotech. Let's actually say, we're going to focus on these and become the global leaders and punch outside our weight class, and those will be the jobs of the future. And I think that's what we need government to do. It doesn't have to be direct dollars in. There's many ways we can support it and get out of the way of these industries, but I do think we need to start thinking industrial policy again. They're not dirty words.
Patty.
Well, in terms of industrial policy, that makes me kind of nervous. But I think one of the problems with this conversation is prosperity is something of a 25 or 50-year plan. And of course, we're tied to election cycles that are a lot shorter than that, and hence the short-termism in our thinking. But I think, to Jim's point, it's about skills, and digital skills, it seems to me, are in demand and are here to stay. There's so many jobs today that weren't around 10 years ago, and I'm not even sure what they do. Things like big data, analytics, mobile app, cybersecurity experts. There's all kinds of wonderful new jobs that are being created, but it has to go down to those digital skills, and maybe that's something that Canada can excel at.
Let's talk some out-of-the-box ideas here. Big out-of-the-box ideas that could have a real impact on a road path to prosperity. Who wants to start? Preet?
Well, you know, as it happens, a couple of weeks ago, there was the launch of this new Eco-Fiscal Commission, and it's basically a group of prominent economists, politicians from all stripes, public and private sector stakeholders. They've come together and they said, listen, if you think that policies that are beneficial for the environment take away from the economy and vice versa, you're wrong. And they said these new eco-fiscal policies can actually show an increase in GDP and employment in countries that have actually implemented some of these policies, which would be things like carbon pricing or congestion taxes and whatnot. So I would actually encourage people, I have no affiliation whatsoever, but ecofiscal.ca, take a look at some of their policies, because the environmental concern over the long term is incredibly important to Canadians.
Amanda.
You know, we all know that our education system is failing kids. It's an industrial era model. It's broken. It's in the provincial jurisdiction, but I actually think there's a role for a federal government in this country to say, we're ripping it up. We're ripping it out and we're starting over.
Good luck with that.
Well, good luck. It's politically difficult, but we all know it has to happen. The educators know it has to happen. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And this tinkering around the edges of it is not working, right? It's putting wheels on a horse, to quote Henry Ford. So I would say one thing that a government with a good mandate could do is say, let's get all of the provinces and territories together and start fresh. What does education for our kids and their kids look like?
All right. Patty.
My idea, or it's not my idea, but it has to do with kids as well and around innovation, because one of the things we talk about in Canada is we're not risk takers, we're not innovators, we're not entrepreneurs. So I stumbled across this thing called Big Ideas, and it's a camp for kids aged 10 to 13. And what they do at this camp is they teach them how to be entrepreneurs. They teach them how to take the idea out of your head and put it out in the real world. And imagine that. I think that could be a game changer if we could inculcate the culture, the thinking in pre-teens to be risk takers. It's okay to fail, to be innovative, to be an entrepreneur. I think that could really change things. I think it should be in the curriculum all across Canada.
Sounds like a documentary in the making there. Jim?
Peter, here's an out-of-the-box idea that I know will go down well in Stephen Harper's Ottawa. Public ownership of industry, okay? It's actually...
That'll work.
It's actually worked.
He's probably taking notes right now on it.
You thought Amanda's
Because this works
idea
so well in
was
Russia.
far-fetched. Well, it's worked well in Canada's past. Many of our actually unique value-added industries, aerospace, the oil sands, et cetera, started with public ownership. We've used it in the auto industry and other sectors, and there's actually a bit of a trend worldwide of public ownership in some very interesting ways, not just crown corporations, but also state investment banks to foster the sorts of industries that I was talking about earlier, or sovereign wealth. This is a big thing in financial markets where governments can indirectly own companies. I think of a place like Singapore. There's a big state investment bank there that owns 50 different companies that are contributing to Singapore's industrial development. I think we could think about doing that in Canada again as well.
Isn't that called protectionism, though?
Investing? I don't know. We've all been disappointed that private companies aren't investing their money as much as we hope that they will. So let's get in and do it ourselves.
China would like to invest.
Time for a quick break. But when we come back, we'll have this question. What wild card could throw everyone's projections off about the future? Welcome back to The Bottom Line. Patty, Jim, Preet, and Amanda are all with us tonight. So if there is a wild card that could throw everybody's projections off about the future, what would that be, Patty?
Oh, there's such a long list, but I'll just go with a few, and that is an implosion in the Chinese economy and a depression in Europe. I think those are the two key ones for me.
And there's worry on both, well,
absolutely.
Perhaps not implosion, but there's certainly worry that things are slowing down to a big degree. Jim?
I go with climate change, Peter. We don't know what it's going to do to the environment or people. We also don't know what it's going to do to the economy. If the rest of the world stops using oil in a big way, which seems increasingly likely, then we, as Amanda was saying earlier, really got to rejig our game.
Preet?
If I could predict the wild card, I'd be a pretty rich guy. So I think by the very definition, you can't really try and place your bets on any one thing. You have to be adaptable to whatever happens, and that's what we do. We adapt to changing information all the time. So I don't know how to answer that.
Jim and I are really in sync today. I think the wild card could be the decline of fossil fuels. And one example of that is the exponential increase in the use of solar and the decline in the cost of solar. Exponential means the curve is parabolic. Some great futurists think within 10 or 15 years, the majority of the world's power is solar. If that happens, Canada needs a plan B.
Well, here's a plan C. You got a surplus next year, forecast, 1.9, almost $2 billion. If you had your options, what would you do with that surplus once around the table? Patty?
What I would do, Peter, is I would repeal the family tax cut. I don't like targeted tax cuts. And I would actually increase the GST back to 7%. Ooh. Every 1 percentage point gets us $7 billion. That surplus lays out all those long-term options for prosperity.
Which party are you going to run for?
The Patty Party.
She's a third person tonight who's not getting elected to anything.
Jim?
My first choice, I come back to that four-letter word, work. Mm-hmm. I would spend whatever the surplus, and it's actually a lot bigger than 1.9. Remember, that's after the $5 billion for this income splitting scheme. I would spend the surplus on universal, accessible childcare. Economic evidence shows that it puts more women in paying work, paying taxes, better productivity. It's an incredible investment.
Preet.
I wouldn't use the $1.9 billion as an anchor for making a decision. I would just say, well, what is the right policy right now? And if that meant a $10 billion program spend, I'd do that. If it meant raising the GST, I'd do that too, which is why I'd also win exactly 0 elections.
This is your last chance not to agree with Jim.
1.9 is a rounding error. I'd say pay down debt, do whatever, but tap the debt markets at incredibly low rates. The federal government should have a plan for infrastructure for the 6 or 7 biggest cities in this country. It should be a 50-year plan. We should be bold. We should invest in it, and that would pay off for everybody economically.
All right. Well, I think, between the four of you, you've definitely charted the path.
This is why we're not on the political panel.
Exactly.
That's right. Thank you all, and thank you as well.